Still, it's an interesting shift in tone, at least compared to the good old days of certainty.
You're okay. You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations.
You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations. Talk about your fake news. Can we get an Ofcom investigation going on that guy? Since saying that, the quadruple vaccinated Joe Biden has had the COVID twice within 3 weeks. Or how about Dr. Sarah Kayat with her claim that you're 100% protected against hospitalization and death? Was there ever any basis for saying what Joe Biden or Dr. Sarah said? I was startled to read this earlier today. What was reported in the mainstream news as being 95% effective against infection was in fact relative risk reduction, not absolute risk reduction, from the double-blind randomized controlled trial that took place during the more lethal circulating post-Wuhan ancestral strain of the virus. That specific New England Journal of Medicine paper, which underpinned the emergency use authorization of the Pfizer mRNA vaccine, actually revealed an absolute risk reduction of 0.84%. 0.84%. In other words, for every 119 individuals vaccinated, one person would be protected from being infected, unquote. For every 119 persons vaccinated, one will be protected from infection. That's from an open letter to Joe Biden and Boris Johnson and various parties that also makes the point that your risk of an adverse side effect from the vaccines is greater than your risk of hospitalization from COVID. The author of that open letter, Dr. Malhotra, joins me now. That's actually quite a staggering number, because if we'd been told that 18 months ago, the whole conversation would have been entirely different.
It's a very good point, Mark. Looking back at that original trial that led to the approval of the Pfizer vaccine and many other vaccines, if we talk about the Pfizer vaccine, for example, that trial, it showed this 95% relative risk reduction in infection. Everyone took on board as thinking 95, if 100 people were exposed, 95 would be protected, which is not the case. It was 0.84% from infection, if we trust that data implicitly, which, of course, many people did, even though that data has never been released for independent analysis, which is something we're advocating for. But in addition to that, Mark, that trial didn't show any reduction in death rates from COVID, statistically significant death rates from COVID, or all-cause mortality. So everything we had to go on at the beginning was based upon that figure that was exaggerated in terms of its benefits.
So these vaccines are declining in popularity because there's a lack of trust in what the experts say. Now, when you talk about that, that 1 in 19 people will be protected from infection, the people who signed off on these vaccines in the public health bureaucracies of the West, they must have known that, mustn't they?
Mark, I wouldn't say necessarily they did. I mean, I've spoke to very senior doctors, leaders in the last few weeks. I've been giving lectures. I actually gave a lecture only a few weeks ago during the BMA annual conference. And attending that conference were senior doctors, like the chair of the BMA, the president of the BMA, the deputy chair of the BMA. And they were quite shocked with some of the information I was sharing with them. So, for example, one very senior NHS leader was shocked to learn that the regulator that approves these vaccines, the MHRA, receive 86% of their funding from the pharmaceutical industry. He didn't believe it, actually, and then the BMJ exposed that only shortly afterwards. And they were also saying to me, it was interesting. I had a conversation with one of these NHS leaders, and he said to me, Asim, I don't think many people in these roles who are promoting the vaccine are critically appraising the evidence themselves, and they are getting most of their information from the BBC. Now, this is not unusual, because Rochelle Walensky, the former chair of the CDC, actually admitted not so long ago her optimism for the vaccine came from a CNN news report, which Paul Thacker, investigative journalist, basically exposes being almost a an identical. It was essentially the press release of Pfizer that was a CNN news report. So this is quite.
Pfizer write the press release for the CNN guy. Somebody in the public health bureaucracy of the the most lavishly funded public health bureaucracy, watches the CNN news report and thinks, oh, everything's hunky-dory. But the problem here is that when you say, like, the regulatory body in the United Kingdom, the Medical Health and Regulatory Agency, MHRA, is 86% funded by Big Pharma. Now, 50 years ago, when everybody was worried about lung cancer from smoking, and if you had said, oh yes, we've got our Ministry of Health is 86% funded by Philip Morris and the big tobacco companies, people would have leapt up and said, this is crazy. Why aren't they leaping up now?
I think because they don't know it so much, Mark.
Yes.
So I think people need to understand the structures that are in place that allow what ultimately is misinformation, or certainly misleading information, to disseminate amongst doctors and the population, is rooted in too much unchecked power by entities whose only purpose is to gain profit, not to look after your health. And I'm talking about the pharmaceutical industry here.
True, but at the same time, we also have a media problem here, because we have things that seem very odd. We have an excess mortality rate right now, have had really all spring and summer, of about 1,000 people a week.
Could the vaccine be linked to these excess deaths? That's the question. I would say it's willful blindness by many people. And I would say, and this is through my own experience speaking to people, so what does that mean? People turning a blind eye in order to feel safe, to avoid conflict, to reduce anxiety, and to protect prestige. And many people, certainly vaccine injuries are a real thing. There's no doubt about it. The question is, what is the extent of those injuries, and how does that balance against what the benefit of the vaccine is? And we haven't got that answer quite precisely yet, but we're getting there. And what I would say for me as a doctor, what really concerned me, and you mentioned it in the letter we wrote to President Biden and Boris Johnson, and actually published in European Scientist, is very eminent doctors, very eminent scientists, Peter Doshi, associate with the BMJ, Robert Kaplan from Stanford. In one of their preprint publications, they were able to get access to new data from Pfizer and Moderna original trials on the vaccine. And what they found is shocking. As you said earlier, that in the trial itself, it appeared that one was more likely to suffer a serious adverse event from the vaccine, so disability, life-changing event, hospitalization, than they were to be hospitalized from COVID. And that was during the more lethal strain. Now, if this is true, and there's a good reason to suggest that it is, then it changes everything.